The press thinks of itself as an anti-racist institution. It doesn't give a damn about Black kids.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Heather McDonald. Heather McDonald is a conservative author and commentator over in America, and she talks about all issues diversity, whether there is racism within police departments. So we're going to be talking all about the woke movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and universities, and whether they have been taken over by left-wing professors. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm honored.
One of the biggest movements this year has been the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, this is obviously something very relevant to topics that you've talked about for a long time. What do you think the impact of the Black Lives Matter protests have been, and do you support their aims?
I think the impact has been absolutely disastrous, both in the narrow field of crime and Black lives. We've seen already a huge escalation in Black homicide deaths since the riots that followed this recent iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't support the aim because the aim is fanciful. It's based on a fiction about American law enforcement. The aim, as I take it, is to end the epidemic of racially biased police shootings of Black men. And that is a claim that is based on no facts whatsoever. All the data about police shootings and crime show that far from being overrepresented among fatal shooting victims by the police, Blacks are actually underrepresented when you take into account their violent crime rates, which is absolutely essential in evaluating any police activity. Obviously, a broader aim of valuing lives is beyond dispute. Of course we do. I would argue that there's no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. And you don't have to take my word for it, Stephen. One can go to any inner city police community meeting in the United States, whether it's in central Harlem in New York or the south side of Chicago. And what you're going to hear from those good law-abiding residents who show up is a fervent desire for more police. They see the police as the only thing standing between them and anarchy. People like a elderly woman who stood up in the 41st precinct of the South Bronx in New York in a police community meeting I attended, and apropos of nothing, just spontaneously burst out, "How lovely when we see the police. They are my friends." Those are the people that the media never talks to because they totally explode the Black Lives Matter narrative of ubiquitous police oppression.
In your opinion, if there's no evidence or very little evidence to support this idea that the police, for example, are systemically racist, which is obviously the argument that Black Lives Matter uses, why has this movement, in your view, blown up so much? I mean, it's one of the biggest movements I can ever think of in my lifetime. It's gone international. Millions of people all around the world are showing their support online and obviously have gone to protest during one of the worst pandemics in over 100 years. Why has this happened?
Yeah, and let's also notice the utter hypocrisy of the public health authorities in declaring that it's not just tolerable, but actually necessary to go to these mass anti-police rallies, riots, and protests. Whereas if a small business owner tries to gather some colleagues to beg to be allowed to open under safe conditions, that is still off limits by the public health establishment. So, but you're right, Stephen, that this has global appeal. I would purport to speak only for the United States. We are a country that anti-racism is now our unofficial religion. The white elites are absolutely committed to the idea that white supremacy is the dominant modus operandi in the United States. And it's a lot easier to talk about police than it is to talk about Black crime. What drives police activity inevitably is rates of violent offending. Police go where people are being victimized, and that is in the minority community. Policing today is data driven. It's not based on population ratios. It's not based on race. It's based on victim reports of where the drive-by shootings are. And it is a very uncomfortable thing for Americans to look at those facts for a variety of reasons. But the facts are these. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 43 die of homicide at 13 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. And the reason for that is not because the police are shooting them. It's not because whites are shooting them. It's because blacks are shooting them. Blacks in the United States commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. You see these disparities in individual cities throughout the United States. In New York City, blacks commit about 3/4 of all drive-by shootings, even though they're 23% of the population. Whites are 34% of the population in New York City. They commit 2 to 3% of all drive-by shootings. In Chicago, the disparities are even greater. A black Chicagoan is 80 times more likely to commit a drive-by shooting than a white Chicagoan. The face of violent street crime in the United States today is overwhelmingly black and Hispanic. That's simply the reality. We know that by the victims. That is what the victims of violent street crime, who are themselves overwhelmingly black and Hispanic, that's what they tell the police. And most Americans turn their eyes away from that fact. We have now the press since the 90s. Many newspapers stopped publishing the race of criminal suspects. These are people who still hadn't been apprehended, and the victim had given a suspect description to the police. The press censored that information, which is completely against the public interest. If a criminal that's just committed a robbery of an 80-year-old woman is still out on the street, you want the public to know every possible fact about that person to get him off the street. The press stopped publishing the race of criminal suspects because they were so overwhelmingly black, and recently several media outlets in the United States have said they're no longer to publish so-called mug shots. These are photos of criminals after they've been arrested for the same reason, because they overwhelmingly show black criminals. And this is, we're told by the Black Lives Matter movement and its larger instantiation in every elite establishment institution today, whether it's a university or a corporation or a big bank, that white supremacy is the dominant characteristic of America. White supremacists would not go out of their way to conceal the federal data on criminal offending. That is not the way a white supremacist would behave, and I would argue that America today is the opposite of a white supremacist country.
I really want to talk about some of the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement talk about, because in my view, this hasn't just sprung out of thin air. This isn't just something that they've completely and utterly made up, even if you say the statistics bear against what they say. And obviously, we all saw that terrible video of the death of George Floyd. And over the years, there have been various cases of police brutality, of bad policing. And a lot of this is aimed at, unfortunately, minority groups in America. Can you talk a little bit about those individual cases that all of these Black Lives Matter supporters would talk about in the last few years? Trayvon Martin and a whole series of other people who have now become almost martyrs to their cause.
Well, do you know who Tony Timpa is, Stephen?
I do not know.
Okay, you've heard of Michael Brown?
Yeah.
The guy killed in Ferguson. You've heard of George Floyd. You mentioned Trayvon Martin. Tony Timpa was a white schizophrenic who in Dallas, Texas in 2016 called 911 saying he was off his meds and scared and needed help. And 3 Dallas police officers responded to him. he'd already been handcuffed by store guards. They kept him in cuffs. They put him in police cuffs, put him on his stomach, and kept their knee on his back for 13 minutes while he pled 30 times saying he couldn't breathe and you're going to kill me. All the while, the 3 Dallas officers were joking about his mental illness and you know, talking about the various mental asylums in the Dallas area. And when they finally loaded him into an ambulance, one of the officers said, well, I hope he's not dead. Well, he was dead. He died, and death was ruled a homicide by virtue of cocaine and the physical pressure applied to him. Daniel Shaver, I bet you also don't know his name, also in 2016, in Mesa, Arizona, a white guy who, there was a call, he was in a motel, there was a call that he had a gun. He was down on his hands and knees in a motel lobby trying to comply with the utterly confusing, conflicting demands that a sergeant was screaming at him. And another officer unleashed his AR-15 rifle at him and killed him. I've got a list in my War on Cops of other unarmed white victims that have been killed. Obviously, the Tony Timpa case completely adumbrates George Floyd. Nobody has heard of those victims because they don't fit the narrative. If any of them had been Black, there's a good chance that they too would have become international cause célèbre like Michael Brown or George Floyd. You say that, well, you know, rhetorically, I certainly can't dispute the facts of these Black shootings. No, I won't dispute the facts, but I will dispute that they in themselves represent a disproportionate problem. What we know about the police, or think we know about the police, is completely a result of selective coverage. The media does not care about white victims of police shootings, just as it doesn't care about Black children who have been toddlers, who have been gunned down in their homes, in their backyards, in their mother's bedrooms, in this latest wave of Black Lives Matter inspired violence, or during the first wave of Black Lives Matter inspired violence. 35 children at least since the George Floyd murder have been killed in drive-by shootings. Almost all of them are Black. We don't hear about those people. They don't count because they don't help the narrative. So, you know, last year, according to the Washington Post database of fatal police shootings, there were 9 unarmed Black victims of police shootings. Now, if the 2019 homicide numbers, which we don't have yet, are the same roughly as 2018, in 2018 there were 7,400 Blacks who were killed of homicide, died of homicide. That's more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims in the US combined. Those 9 unarmed victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all Blacks who died of homicide. And the Washington Post defines unarmed extremely liberally to include suspects who had grabbed an officer's gun and was beating him with it, or were escaping from a lawful car stop with a loaded semi-automatic pistol on the car seat next to them. That's what it means to be an unarmed victim of a police shooting in the Washington Post database. I don't think that 1% of all Blacks who die of homicide who were shot while allegedly unarmed as a police represents a crisis of police brutality. There were 19 so-called unarmed white victims in 2019. This is not the problem, Stephen. The problem in the Black community is not the police. It's fatherless young males who are growing up without a marriage culture, without any incentive to develop bourgeois values, who use gangs as father substitutes, and who are completely out of control. The mindlessness of these drive-by shootings that are taking down children is beyond belief. That is, if that ends, I can guarantee you there will not be any police disproportions. And the police disproportions in activity and stops and arrests only look disproportionate when you compare them to population data. When you compare police activity to crime data, the disproportions reverse.
For now, and we can get back to this later, I just want, in this very specific question, I just want to get to the nub of this issue. But for now, let's put to one side the extrapolation that these deaths of Black people from the police are representative of a wider major issue within police departments, are representative of what they call systemic racism, are representative of a huge wave of police brutality. Let's put that sort of extrapolation to one side and deal with the people that have died, whether it's white or Black. You know, you've mentioned some of those white people who unfortunately were killed by police. There is an issue going on there, isn't there? There is some kind of issue with police brutality, even if it's, you know, statistically not large. There is still an issue, and I want you to kind of tackle that issue there of police brutality. There is a bit of it. There is some of it. What's your solutions to it? And do you recognize that there is a problem?
There have been bad shootings. There have been horrific shootings that turn the stomach. And for any innocent person to be killed by the police is obviously a grotesque violation of why we have government and the trust that we put in law enforcement. So everything that can be done to eliminate any kind of officer mistake when it comes to the use of lethal force should be done. And I can tell you, Stephen, that officers are desperate for more hands-on, realistic tactical training that will help them make these excruciating split-second decisions in the dark to try and figure out whether that guy that you've stopped that is lunging towards you is armed or not. You know, what is that he's got in his hand that he's just grabbed? What degree of force do you need to use? Those are very, very difficult decisions, and officers have high levels of stress. Your adrenaline is pumping. So anything that can help, we all, myself as well as my ideological opponents, talk about de-escalation training. Unfortunately, I just saw a study that shows that de-escalation training, which helps officers talk situations down, there's not much empirical evidence that it works. There's also, people have said, well, let's help officers cope with stress, because stress can also cloud one's judgment. I would say the most important thing is that tactical training. Put them in realistic scenarios, have them go through again and again how best to take cover so that they're not in a situation where they feel that their only option to save either their lives or the lives of bystanders to use lethal force. So would I ever deny that there have been bad shootings? No. However, Stephen, what I would like to hear from the anti-cop forces is what is a proper benchmark to judge police use of force. Every year for the last 5 years, which is when we have our most comprehensive data, the police in the United States have shot 1,000 people in a population of what, 330 million, 340 million in the US. The police make about 50 million arrests each year. And according to different calculations, they have up to maybe 300 million police civilian encounters of various sorts. In the largest jurisdictions of this country, which represent 2/3 of all jurisdictions, there's about 27 deadly weapons assaults on officers each day in this country. And for every 10 deadly weapons assaults on an officer, the police shoot fatally one person. Now, is that too many? It well may be. I'm asking this question not really rhetorically, I don't have an answer in mind. I don't know what is the proper expectation of those 1,000 people that the police shoot each year fatally. The vast majority are armed and dangerous and threatening the officer or bystander. Now, I know that the 1,000 sounds very high to somebody living in the United Kingdom because your officers are by and large not armed. So any officer use of lethal force must seem excessive to you. But we are a much more violent country than the United States. Our rates of gun homicide among young males is about 40 to 50 times higher than in most countries in the rest of the industrialized world. So, you tell me, or anybody, I would like them to know what would be a number that would show no police brutality. And while I certainly do not want to sound like I'm justifying any of those bad shoots, it is the case that members of every other profession make really terrible life-altering decisions and mistakes. And sometimes those are fatal in the case of doctors and medical malpractice. Sometimes they just have the capacity to destroy somebody's life, whether it's a lawyer or a journalist. So mistakes are a feature of humanity. We don't get it right all the time. Tragically and terrifyingly, it is the case that when police make a mistake, the results can be fatal. And as I say, of course I am for doing everything to screen, to constantly retrain to avoid that. But I have to say, it is to a certain degree, as a purely statistical matter, almost inevitable that the police are going to make some mistakes, just as journalists make mistakes, and corporate CEOs make mistakes, and chemists make mistakes. And sadly, some of those mistakes will have very serious consequences.
Well, we're all human, and that's a really important point to make, obviously. And I don't want to pretend to anyone that being a police officer in America, especially where you could be knocking on someone's door who has a gun and has the ability to be able to kill you. That doesn't generally happen in countries like the United Kingdom. So that mustn't be an easy job. And even in the UK, being a police officer again, I can't even, imagine some of the decisions that those people have to make. I want to get your view on the impact that this is having on police officers in America, the constant narrative that we've talked about already, that police departments are systemically racist. And, I'll talk about the UK very briefly, and then you can answer that question. But in the UK last year, we had 2 unarmed black people or minority people being killed by police. And one of them was a terrorist on London Bridge. So it's very rare in the UK for this to happen. Very rare. However, we've seen Black Lives Matter protesters abuse cops. We've seen them throw items at cops. And we've seen them, chant some of the most absolutely disgusting things at police officers. One of the chants that they said during a Black Lives Matter protest in London was, hands up, don't shoot. And as you mentioned earlier, the UK doesn't have, 99% of police officers don't have weapons. So I'm not quite sure what the crowd was worried about being shot with. And these same police officers in London, they took the knee in front of these protesters. And then 10 minutes later, the protesters were throwing items at them and attacking them. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that this is having on the psychology of police departments in America? And I'm sure it's the same thing going on in Britain as well.
Of course, it's the same thing, Stephen. You're absolutely right. And one should never capitulate. It will earn you nothing. We're seeing now all of these elite professionals apologize for their alleged white supremacy. It earns you nothing. So one's better off going down fighting with the truth. The impact on the police morale in this country is devastating. There is no other profession where you, from day one, you start on the job and you are presumed a racist, and there is nothing you can do to clear your name in the current environment, where you have, again, every elite institution, every single American university and college that I know of, I know of 2 exceptions that have not come out with chest-thumping, self-righteous statements about police brutality and the lethal racist nature of policing. We were hearing that from all the big tech companies, from every insurance company. The retirements in the New York Police Department are up 75%. Minneapolis, which was where George Floyd died during that awful arrest, you know, when they were locked into their police precinct, the 3rd police precinct on the second day of riots, and people were firebombing them and trying to burn the place down. Those officers were writing farewell notes and their last testaments to their families because they thought they'd never get out again alive. And so as a personal psychological matter, it has an enormous effect. But if we only want to couch all of our public policy in terms of its impact on Blacks, which is basically what the United States modus operandi is now, it has a terrible effect on Blacks, because we saw this in 2015 and 2016 in the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014, that gave rise to the totally apocryphal hands up, don't shoot mantra that you mentioned that was chanted at police in London. He never said it. His friend lied through his teeth to police investigators in describing how that interaction between Brown and the police officer unfurled. In 2015 and 2016, you had a first iteration, you had riots in Baltimore, in Ferguson, in other places across the country. Same narrative, police are systemically racist. It's racist to stop and get out of your police car and question somebody hanging out on a known drug corner at 1 a.m., hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun. And so cops, understandably and arguably quite appropriately, started backing off of that large range of enforcement, which is purely discretionary. They don't have to do it. What cops are mandated to do is, if they've got a police crime call that comes over their radio, meaning somebody's already been robbed, they are mandated to go to that call. In between calls, though, if they have any time and they observe suspicious street behavior or low-level criminal activity that nobody's called in, they don't have to make that stop. They can just drive on by. And most cops are sort of lazy, and they do. They just let it go. But there's some active cops that get out and say, I know the crime patterns in this neighborhood. I recognize those gangbangers. I'm going to get out and ask them a few questions. So 2015, 2016, the first version of what I called the Ferguson effect. Cops were demoralized. They backed off. What was the result? Criminals were emboldened. Homicide went through the roof. Biggest 2-year increase in homicide in this country in 50 years. Victims, almost exclusively Black. Another 2,000 Black males were killed in 2015 and 2016, thanks to the Ferguson effect compared to 2014 numbers. What are we seeing now? Ferguson effect 2.0, or better, Minneapolis effect, is so far more cataclysmic and faster than anything I observed in 2015. When in 2015, over the first few months, you started seeing the crime numbers go up. St. Louis, Atlanta. Now, in the last month, you have homicide increases of up to 240% in cities, shooting increases up to 200%. It is astounding. And again, the victims have been overwhelmingly Black. In Chicago, there's one person shot every 2 hours and 14 minutes. Again, this is not really you guys in Britain, you don't know what it's like in our cities. 4 children under the age of 12 in Chicago have been killed in these drive-by shootings. A 1-year-old boy driving with his father on Father's Day. His father's a gangbanger. The rivals shoot at the father. The boy is killed. This is routine, and it's going to get a lot worse as the cops back off, as they let the rowdy youth hang out by the hundreds on corners fighting. It's out of those uncontrolled scenes of social disorder that more violent crime emerges. The only thing that's going to stop this is if white kids start getting killed. The press thinks of itself as an anti-racist institution. It doesn't give a damn about Black kids. This country went into a meltdown when there was a mass school shooting in the town of Newton in the state of Connecticut several years ago. There were 20 students, white students, who were killed. This became a national hysteria. There is the equivalent of death count, body count of a Newton, Connecticut, once or twice each year at least among Black children, and nobody gives a damn because it doesn't fit the racism narrative. It's the crime increase, the demoralization of the cops, the attacks on the cops are only going to stop if white kids start getting mowed down in this current crime wave that we're living through mostly in the inner cities.
I want to start talking about some other issues, cancel culture and universities, but I'm going to ask one more question about the police. And if you could answer relatively briefly, feel free to sort of answer as much as you want, but it would be useful if you could answer relatively briefly. I want to put 2 points to you. First of all, the defund the police movement, let's call it, chant, whatever you want to call it, it's become a quite prolific in certain areas of the left in America. Certain politicians, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, an American Democratic politician, is very much in favor of this, and so are other Democrats. Joe Biden himself has said that he won't do this, and the same in the UK. The Labour Party, the left-wing version, has said that they won't do this, so it's worth pointing that out. But there are some mayors and governors in America who are deciding to already start doing this. We've seen this in New York and other American cities, and as you mentioned, crime already has skyrocketed in places like New York. So that's the first point, the defund the police. The second point, I want to put to you a review of your book that I saw on Wikipedia, of all places, and I want you to respond to this short sentence from your review about the war on cops, your book. This is from Tim Lynch, the director of a libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, and he said this: "What MacDonald calls a war on cops is better described as a much-needed debate about crime, law enforcement tactics, and how to deal with systemic police misconduct. Conservatives have some worthwhile ideas to offer in this debate, but MacDonald's polemics add heat, not light."
Well, the defund movement, again, I just wish Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would go to the Mount Hope section of the Bronx. I mentioned the woman in the 41st precinct. She should also talk to a woman named Mrs. Sweeper, a cancer amputee, who told me, "Please, Jesus, send more cops." The only time she feels safe to go into her building lobby is when the police are there. Otherwise, she said, it's colonized by trespassing youth, selling drugs, and smoking weed. Talk to the law-abiding Black residents of Black communities about whether they want to defund the police, and you're going to get a very different answer. It's an absurd idea. The idea that we have been somehow stinting on social service spending is ridiculous. New York City was the welfare capital of the United States for decades. It spent 1/7 of all welfare dollars in the United States, even though its population, maybe 5 million out of a population of 330 million, didn't do anything. The only thing that brought crime down was in the 1990s, we had Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who introduced a method of policing that was data-driven. It held police commanders accountable for crime in their jurisdictions. This is known broadly as comp stat policing. I write about it in my book, and it's written about much elsewhere. Police are not the best solution to crime. Families are, but police are the second best solution. So the idea first that we haven't been investing a lot of welfare programs in inner city is ridiculous. It's all we've been doing since the war on poverty in the 1960s. And when families break down and you have kids that have not been socialized on the street, I'm sorry, the people that want to live safe lives need the police. As far as Tim Lynch, he's a libertarian. You know, I've happy to have a debate about what he thinks are police excesses based on what the proper benchmark is. I would argue that policing today is more professional than it's ever been. One could say, well, it was so unprofessional before. The fact that it's more professional doesn't mean it's good. But by and large, it really is. And as I say, there are mistakes, but I simply don't see this as a systemic problem. The real risk, however, is the narrative. I'm actually willing to de-incarcerate to a certain extent because any given sentence length is totally arbitrary. So if it was 2 years shorter, 2 years longer, nobody would know the difference really. The real problem is the narrative in which the so-called police reforms is being done, and that is the name in which it's being done, that the narrative about systemic racism, that is what is most poisonous and insidious.
Let's talk about cancel culture. Now, I know that you experienced a few years ago an example of what many people would call cancel culture. And in recent days, some people would say that you've recently had a similar experience, or one that one could describe as being cancelled, in which you had a discussion on YouTube, much like this one, I suspect. I mean, I haven't seen it, I have to be honest, about Black Lives Matter. And YouTube decided to take down the video, and then they put it back up, and they put an age restriction on it. And YouTube said, it was all just an accident. We didn't mean to take down the video. Do you believe them?
No, of course not. Now, I don't know when we're going to be airing today, Stephen, but it's Friday. This was yesterday, Thursday. I gave a Zoom speech at the Center of the American Experiment in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed. And it was broadcast live, and then YouTube took it down during the streaming or right after and sent a message saying it's in violation of our community guidelines. The president of the center wrote an appeals, and they eventually appeal letter, and they eventually put it back up under age restrictions. The fact of the matter is that the elite gatekeepers of information in our culture now are fundamentally dedicated to the left-wing interpretation of America, and they are dedicated to the idea that there is ubiquitous white supremacy. And the standards that they exercise in enforcing these community guidelines are patently one-sided. There simply is nothing resembling what happens to innocuous conservative content on the left. It doesn't happen. I would defy anybody to come up with a list of left-wing content that has been erased to the extent that that's true of the left. My speech, you can see it, it's Center on the American Experiment. It simply gives federal data. It gives the numbers about police shooting deaths, crime, all of which is out there in the public sphere, and yet that is not allowed. So we know that they exercise a very strong censoring force, whether we want to quibble over whether it should be called censorship because it's not government power, I don't know. This grows out of the campus, and you mentioned, yes, I've had shout downs constantly on college campuses. I suppose the most famous was at a small private liberal arts college in Southern California called Claremont McKenna, where in the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, the first iteration of the Ferguson Effect, I was going to give a speech to about 300 people in an auditorium about policing. And the students there shut it down. They barricaded the building and wouldn't let anybody in. I gave the speech to an empty hall because, again, nobody could get in. And then the police inside decided they couldn't guarantee my safety because people were outside pounding on the plate glass windows. And they thought that the situation was getting too dangerous. So I was escorted out the kitchen. But similar things, not quite as totalitarian in their capacity to shut things down, although those have been the efforts, have happened. And so I think what we're living through today, both in terms of this Black Lives Matter and the cancel culture, as well as I would argue, the overreaction to the coronavirus with the economic shutdowns, is a result of the safetyism ideology that's come out of the university setting, both in the United States and in the UK to a slightly lesser extent, but it does exist there as well.
Let's talk about universities, and I'm going to ask a question from my own experiences, but I think that it applies to many, many people all around the world. So I apologize to people who don't like asking questions themselves, but I'm going to do that because I think it applies to a lot of people. When I was 18, I didn't go to university. I chose to go straight into work. I tried to read as much as possible about politics and culture, and I went straight into journalism. And I've been doing various aspects of journalism for a couple of years now, and now I'm at The Sun, and I've done a load of interviews there. And I'm trying to basically make sure that my knowledge is up to scratch, and I can keep my wits about me. I'm still considering, maybe, do I go to university? There's lots of scare stories that people talk about if you're conservative or don't necessarily sign up to this kind of woke agenda, let's put it like that, that you're going to be ostracized or isolated. Can you comment on, or can I ask you very directly, do you think I should go to university, whether it's in America or the UK or anywhere else?
I've only given up on the idea of universities in the last 2 months. If you could go to the university as I think of it, as your great British philosopher Michael Oakeshott thought of it, as the means whereby one generation passes on a civilizational inheritance to the next generation, I would say there's nothing more important in life than one can do. To have that privilege, that luxury of studying the greatest works of mankind, before which we should be down on our knees in gratitude for their beauty and sublimity and insight. And I aspired to be a university professor. Again, I could think of nothing greater in life than to be the curator of our cultural inheritance. And so as I watched with sorrow the takeover that I think began really in earnest in the 1980s of the humanities spreading into the social science, the rise of identity politics, the rise of the absurd feminist idea that as a female, one should really only read female writers, and to read male writers is somehow oppressive and they can't possibly understand female experience, or to be Black, you should read Black writers. All of this, which is such a demeaning and a misunderstanding of the power of the human imagination. I still held out hope. What I've seen from the universities in the last month and a half since the George Floyd riots, where they have all now officially declared themselves, their raison d'etre is as anti-racist institutions. They have signed on officially, it was always unofficial, now it's official, to a highly specific view and interpretation of the world. They've now declared that as beyond dispute, which is the interpretation that Western civilization is oppressive, the source of oppression. I've given up on them, and they cannot be salvaged. So I'm not sure what it would be worth you to go back, unless, now I have to say, one always needs a kind of refuge in one's mind, an imaginary place to go to where things are better. And I attended Cambridge University for 2 years after college, Clare College, and it had been touched at that point in 78 to 80 by deconstruction, the literary theory that I absorbed too uncritically to my despair as an undergraduate. But it was still, you could still read the glories of British literature without the obfuscating nonsense of high literary theory. And I still believe, I like to believe, I have to believe that kind of study is still possible in Britain. You know, I see the attacks on Rhodes statues and Oxford extending the tests on its math exams to try and engineer more sex proportionality in math and computer science graduates. And I wonder, but maybe you can find yourself a university in the UK somewhere, whether it's Scotland or Britain, I don't know, that would allow you to immerse yourself. I would also say this, I wouldn't go back to the university in order to study communications or marketing or even necessarily political science. I would go back for the great works. Now you can read those on your own, obviously, but there is something about the eros of learning and being in the presence of a great scholar who has a passion for his material that is like nothing else. Now, those people are dying out. The younger group of graduate students that are coming up have been thoroughly marinated in identity politics. So again, time may have already passed. So I would, if I were you, I would only go if you're going with very clear intentions to lose yourself in beauty, and if you're sure that you're in an institution that will allow you to do so.
Well, thank you for that free advice. I'll certainly take it on board. What are the issues? Can we talk about specifics here? What exactly are you worried about that is being taught at the moment in American, British, but let's focus on American universities because I think this is probably more prolific in America. Although a lot of people in Britain say what happens in America, basically they're 5 years ahead of us and we're all going to catch up very soon. What exactly is being taught that worries you so much?
I would say that's true for obesity too. You guys are almost catching up to us on obesity and explains some of the COVID deaths. What is being taught? Well, what is not being taught? What is not being taught is American history, period. No constitutional history. What is being taught is the idea that, exemplified by, I don't know, we're all kind of obsessed with this here in the United States, the New York Times' 1619 Project, which is this allegedly journalistic effort at history to show that the very purpose of America and its founding ideology was that of slavery that never ended. It was founded to preserve slavery, to create slavery. The historical narrative has been undercut by a number of older historians, some of the greats of American colonial history. Nevertheless, that viewpoint is not only being spread now in our elementary and secondary education, our high schools. I can't remember what your counterpart phrases are there, but certainly in American universities. And so there's an entire bureaucracy in American universities that you have to a certain extent as well, the diversity bureaucracy. These are people that have no scholarly background. They are, if anything, they've gotten a degree in university management or administration, but their purpose is to tell students from the moment they step on campus that they're either an oppressed person or the oppressor. And so they have all sorts of freshman seminars and dorm meetings and freshman orientations that rub students' nose in the whole theory of white privilege, that tell Black students to think of themselves as oppressed by racism on an American college campus. Now, I just have to emphasize, Stephen, how false this is. There is not a single American college campus that is in any degree selective in admissions. It isn't simply everybody can come in, that does not practice a very large degree of racial preference, meaning that a Black student with a certain degree of objective scores on objective standardized tests will be admitted to that university with scores that would be automatically disqualifying if offered by a white or Asian student. So the idea that these universities are institutionally racist is factually, demonstrably wrong. The reason, and it's a tragic situation because racial, any kind of preference, whether it's sex preference or race preference, creates something called mismatch. By catapulting a student into an academic environment for which he is not competitive academically, puts him at a disadvantage, and he's going to struggle. If the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, Massachusetts, which is one of our premier science and engineering schools, it is predominantly male. Who cares? Who cares? It's objective and meritocratic. If it admitted me to its freshman class with math SATs, and I'm sorry to use a score that is not a scale that's not going to be particularly meaningful, but 600 on my math SATs out of a scale of 800. And all my peers had averages close to 800. But they admitted me because they want gender proportionality. I'm going to struggle in that first year because the freshman calculus, advanced calculus, is going to be pitched at a level that I can't keep up with. The same thing happens with race preferences. By putting students in that are a standard deviation below of academic qualifications into these schools, they struggle, and they are taught by the diversity bureaucracy to interpret their struggles as a function of racism. So what these schools are teaching, they are not teaching Milton, they are not teaching Spencer. My first year at Yale University, I was there before gender politics hit, before race politics hit. I was allowed to read Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, Wordsworth, and Wallace Stevens without ever thinking to complain about their race and gender. Today, that would not be possible. And in fact, Yale has almost canceled that course. It used to be the gateway to major in English literature. Now, a bunch of Black students said it was physically injurious to them to read Milton and Wordsworth, that this put their lives at risk. And Yale's professors, rather than defending these authors as essential to understanding, if you're going to be an English literature major and you don't understand what these authors contributed to the evolution of literary style, to what is possible to be expressed in the English language, you are not educated in English literature. Rather than saying that, the Yale faculty caved, and they made that course optional and supplemented it with writers of color. I have nothing against writers of color, but I'm sorry, given the historical truths, they are not as influential as those greats of English literature. So the universities today are teaching race hatred. They're teaching a phony gender victimology. And the graduates of these universities are going out into the world at large. They're bringing this ideology into corporations. They're bringing it into government. They're bringing it into the media. And we see the results today.
Now, in my view, in my very naive view, I don't think that some of these things, let's say they want to focus more on Black authors who have maybe, haven't had the spotlight on them for a long time. Maybe there were reasons for that in the past that weren't right, completely. Maybe they weren't prolific because of racism, or let's say that was the case. That's totally fine with me. I think it's perfectly acceptable to show some new authors, and if they've got some fantastic literature or ideas, whatever, then that's great. The problem that I think many people have is that this comes from a political ideology, and that's basically the reason why they would rather rather show you those kind of authors rather than some of the other ones that used to be more prolific. And, I'll give you an example of this. When I was deciding whether to go to university, I got into the London School of Economics and had a place there. And I went to one of the taster lectures, and it was a lecture about history. And this lecturer, it was all focused about an hour and a half on these Black feminist journalists in the 1920s, I think in Paris and in the Caribbean, who this lecturer said had a huge, major impact on world history. And I just thought, fine, maybe that is the case. But if I'm going to be subjected to a kind of political, I don't want to use the word indoctrination, that's maybe too far, but a political syllabus, then maybe that's something that I don't necessarily want to do. Anyway, putting that point to one side, I do want to ask, some of your critics say this about your your book on diversity and your book on universities and campuses today, they say that conservative authors have for a very long time, I think William F. Buckley did this in the 1950s, been talking about the leftist bias in universities. And this is something that, has been talked about for decades and decades. And your critics would say that you are just another conservative author scaremongering, maybe that's the word that they would use, or coming up with these ideas that universities are left-wing bias and there's this big crisis. Perhaps this has been going on for a long time and you're just one of those authors who's been talking about this. And I think the main point that those critics of yours would make is that perhaps this is just a blip. I mean, you could look to the 1990s, there's a very big craze for political correctness. You could look to the 1960s and there was a huge left-wing radical movement that spawned out of universities and really got a lot of ground at that time. But in the end, I think things pretty much settled down. So what do you make to this point that actually, this is just a blip and it will all settle down in the next decade or so?
Well, it's not a blip. It's a growing curve. I don't know if it's exponential or not. It certainly feels exponential in the last 2 months. Yes, the 60s began it with the physical assaults on university presidents, on buildings, just, this comparable, maybe not to the same degree of what we're seeing now, of Black Panther takeovers of Columbia and Chicago and Claremont, in fact, where I spoke. And that began the regime of racial preferences, Black studies. The 80s, 70s were not quite as political, but it was all happening. I mean, it still was happening. There was gender studies in the 70s. It just wasn't quite the force. In the 80s, it became stronger. The 90s, you got the reign of the speech codes, students being thrown out for violating speech codes that were supposed to protect and keep safe allegedly victim groups, which again, this rhetoric is so maudlin. It is so embarrassing that any privileged college student could say that he's unsafe on American college campus is absurd. Again, he is the most privileged individual in human history to have at his fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. But it continued. The 2000s continued. I don't see it as a blip. Yes, and I guess you could say in the 1960s, generally, American society didn't fall apart, but the serious pursuit of learning got weaker and weaker. I left academia when I realized that the literary theory that I had studied as an undergraduate, known as deconstruction or post-structuralism, was not at all an accurate understanding of language. And I left, but I still yearned to be in a university environment. And I loved libraries, being in the stacks. Every time I went back and looked at those same graduate departments in comparative literature that were the hot theory-based ones, it got worse and worse. And now there's very little serious learning based on gratitude and love left, very little. And the idea that it's just a blip, come on, what are we seeing in the tech community, in Google and Amazon? These are groups in Twitter and YouTube that are actively trying to tip the scales. Google fired a young computer engineer in the summer of 2018 in August, James Damore, who wrote a fact-based memo, 10 pages, suggesting that Google, in fact, may not be sexist. The fact that they don't have 50-50 male to female computer engineers may not be the result of alleged sexism, that Google's managers and hires are so bigoted and sexist that they are just passing over these competitively qualified females. Damore suggested that maybe it's because on average, not talking about the females at Google, but in the population at large, on average, females are more inclined towards human-centered work rather than abstract ideas-centered work, which males on average are more inclined for. Google fired James Damore for merely writing that memo. And the language that its CEO used, Sundar Pichai, who was recently testifying on Capitol Hill this week, in firing Damore, was a verbatim import from academic victimology. He said that Damore's memo made Google's female engineers feel unsafe. That's pathetic. Any female who feels unsafe because somebody has written a memo saying that, well, maybe there's other explanations, and all the diversity training that we're going through, maybe it's not quite necessary. I would be ashamed to take that position, but we see now the academic rhetoric of safetyism, the idea that to be a Black engineer at Google or at Facebook is to be under constant assault. Again, a preposterous claim. These are some of the most liberal institutions, as are college campuses. College campuses are probably the most liberal institutions in human history. They are not making any of their members unsafe, but this ideology has now taken over the mainstream establishment in the United States.
I'm glad that you touched on there some of the impacts of this woke ideology that's being taught in universities on the real world, because many people would say, this is just isolated to university campuses. As people get older, they naturally turn more conservative as they have to start to pay taxes, perhaps, or I'm sure there's various other reasons for that as well. So I'm glad that you touched on that. Just to finish off the interview, I want to ask one more question, if you've got the time, about diversity and the issue of diversity. And I'm going to play devil's advocate slightly here. I mean, I think this may be a pretty legitimate point in some ways. In some senses, diversity is a strength. Now, you could say, perhaps looking at diversity of opinion, diversity of thought. But I think that, if you've got a good team together, let's say of journalists, the industry that I'm in, and they come from different backgrounds and different perspectives, and they've had different, things going on in their lives, or even if they've come from different industries, I think that's fantastic. You can have different views. You can have a fantastic kind of, what do they call it? The free marketplace of ideas, and you can have a debate or whatever it is. So, isn't it true that, in some senses, diversity is a fantastic thing?
Well, I don't know if you're asking me, is there good kinds of diversity, in which case I'm sure, of course there are, or if you're asking me, therefore, is the types of gender and race mandated diversity a good thing? And I would say, no, it's not. In the latter case, it is being engineered deliberately. Race and gender or sex trump qualifications. The reason that there is not proportional representation, say, of Blacks at Google or in physics labs is because there's an academic skills gap. It is huge. The average Black 12th grader reads at the level of the average white 8th grader in this country. And that gap never closes. The math gap is just as big. About 40% of Black 8th graders do not even have basic math skills. That gap does not close. And so when you have a corporation deliberately engineering race diversity, it means putting meritocratic considerations aside and making race a qualification or sex in itself. And I would say that it's not in the interest of the institution, but as I said before, when I'm talking about mismatch, it's not even in the interest of the alleged beneficiary of that preference.
And on that, thank you so much, Heather McDonald, for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.